Welcome again to another video drasha. This week's Torah portion is Devarim, and it is the first portion in the last book, the fifth book of the Torah. And as I often like to comment on the name of the book when we begin a new one, and indeed Devarim, the Hebrew name for this book, is simply the first word or the first important word in the book. It begins, Ve'ele hadvarim, and these are the words which Moses spoke on the other side of the river. But it's interesting that in this book there is another name given, and that is Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah means second law. And indeed, that is where the English Deuteronomy comes from. Deuteronomy is from the two words deutero nomos, also meaning second law. Now, the reason why this is called Mishnah Torah, or second law, is because in this book, Moses reviews much of what has already happened. There's a lot of repetition in the book of Deuteronomy of events and laws that were given primarily in the books of Exodus and Numbers. Now, one needs to note, however, that when I say repetition, the book of Deuteronomy does not simply repeat stories or laws from those other books. It, as a matter of fact, presents them in ways that are sometimes quite different from what we saw in the original account in Exodus or Numbers. And that is something that various biblical commentators have noted over the centuries, and they've attempted to explain various differences between Deuteronomy and the same story as it occurs in those other books. So let us also note, where are we in the big picture? And where we are is in the last month of the 40 years of the wandering in the wilderness. And so we're right on the verge of the entry into the promised land. And really, the book of Deuteronomy consists of the farewell speeches of Moses to the people, which is why in these speeches he reviews what has occurred to them since the Exodus, and he also repeats many of the laws. And then, particularly towards the end of Deuteronomy, Moses, let's say, gives speeches in which he provides motivation for observing the mitzvot, observing the laws when they go into the land into the promised land. And indeed, close to the end of the book of Deuteronomy is the famous Tochecha, the portion which gives all of the curses, all of the catastrophes that are going to befall the people if they do not remain loyal to the covenant. So we're in the last month, and something that we should actually think about is, who is Moses addressing here? He's addressing the new generation. Remember, the generation that left Egypt, they have died off. That was the purpose of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, so that that generation would not enter into the promised land. Moses is now addressing their children. That's why I think it's necessary for him to repeat and to go back over all of these events that actually happened to their parents. And so that's why much of the book of Deuteronomy is a rehearsal of the events and laws that we've already seen, again, primarily in the books of Exodus and Numbers. There's an interesting thing that I wanted to point out in the first aliyah to this week's Torah portion. And it's a question of the custom of how we read the Torah, how we break up the aliyahs. Now, I want to remind you, I'm sure most of us are aware, that we read the Torah not only on Shabbos mornings, where we read the entire Torah portion, but of course, we read the Torah also on Shabbos afternoon at Mincha, and also on Monday and Thursday mornings at the morning service. Now, what is it that we read on Shabbos afternoon and Monday and Thursday mornings? What we read is the first aliyah of the coming week's Torah portion. So we take the first aliyah and we break it into three, so that there are three aliyahs, Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael. But what we're reading is really the first aliyah of the week's Torah portion. But there's something unique in this week's portion, and that is when we read this on Shabbos afternoon, Monday and Thursday mornings, we read the first 11 verses. And we break those first 11 verses into the three aliyahs. But on Shabbos morning, when we read this portion, we stop the first aliyah after the 10th verse. So what's the reason for this custom? It's really a custom. The reason is because the 12th verse begins with the word Eicha. And Eicha is the name of the book of Lamentations. On Tisha B'Av, we read the book of Lamentations. As a matter of fact, this coming week, we will be reading the book of Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, and Lamentations is called in Hebrew Eicha. And again, that is simply the first word in the book of Lamentations. It begins with the words Eicha Yashva Badad, how the city dwells alone. And indeed, the word Eicha is just the word for how the city dwells alone. And in our portion here, the 12th verse begins with the word Eicha. So that's why during the week we read the first 11 verses, but on Shabbos we only read the 10th verse, up through the 10th verse, because otherwise the second aliyah would begin with the word Eicha. And apparently the tradition felt that, Eicha is so connected with all of the tragedies and catastrophes and things, the destructions in Jewish history, that you don't want to begin an aliyah with the word Eicha. But now this does point us to something, and that is that this Torah portion is always the Torah portion read on the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av. Now this Shabbos also has another name as well. This Shabbos is called Shabbat Chazon, and that is taken from the Haftarah portion. Again, the first word of the Haftarah portion is Chazon, which means vision or prophecy. And our Haftarah portion this week is the first chapter of the book of Isaiah. And it begins with the word Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amoz, the vision or the prophecy of Isaiah, the son of Amoz. And so this is called Shabbat Chazon, which is always the Shabbat prior to Tisha B'Av. And if we look actually at the Haftarah reading, at the first chapter of the book of Isaiah, we see, of course, that Isaiah is castigating the people for their misdeeds. And he actually describes how the country has been destroyed. As a matter of fact, he's speaking as if the country has already been destroyed. He says, your cities are laid waste. And he says something very strong. He says, if it wouldn't be that God left a small remnant of you, you would have been like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, who, of course, were completely destroyed because of their wickedness. And what is it that Isaiah accuses the people of? He accuses them of robbery, of stealing, of murdering, and also of not taking care of the widow and the orphan, not pursuing justice. So Isaiah makes it very clear that the Jewish people have been punished because of their misdeeds, because of their criminality. He even goes so far as to say, Isaiah says, speaking, of course, for God, he says, I'm tired of all of these sacrifices. I'm sated already. I've had enough of your sacrifices. And he says, I hate your Sabbaths. I hate your new moons. I hate your holidays, which sounds, of course, very harsh. And also you could say, why would God say, I don't want these things, I don't want these sacrifices, I hate your Sabbaths and your new moons. After all, the sacrifices are all prescribed in the book of Leviticus, in the Torah. Obviously, the observance of Sabbath and of new moon and of the holidays is in various places in the Torah. So it seems a little bit difficult to explain why Isaiah would be saying this. Now, the fact is, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century, there were many Jews, particularly within Reform Judaism, who took the words of Isaiah, and indeed there are similar words in the other prophetic books, in Amos, Hosea, Micah, Jeremiah. This idea that God says, I hate your sacrifices. I've already had enough sacrifices, or I hate your Sabbaths and your new moons. And they understood those passages as saying that God doesn't want rituals. God doesn't want rituals. What does he want? He wants you to live a life of ethics and morality and the pursuit of justice and the like, and that we should care for the widow and the orphan. God doesn't care about these things like, are you observing Sabbath? Are you observing the holidays? And so that view, which was very pervasive in the late 19th century and early 20th century in Reform Judaism, they found support for their jettisoning of Jewish ritual in these passages in the books of the prophets. But I think if we look a little bit more closely at the words of Isaiah, we'd have to say Isaiah is not saying that God doesn't want us to, for instance, observe this Shabbos. The point is, God doesn't want us to observe the Shabbos and then go and cheat and steal and do other immoral acts. That's what God doesn't want. God, the idea that the Israelites were observing, they were bringing their sacrifices, they were observing the Sabbath, but on the other hand, they were robbing and stealing and murdering and not caring for the widow and the orphan. That's what Isaiah is pointing to as being the source of God's anger. And it reminds me of a story that I heard many years ago. I've repeated this before, but the story, I heard the story told of Rav Schwab. Rav Schwab was the rabbi of the German Jewish community in Washington Heights in New York. And when I heard this many years ago, that someone came to Rav Schwab and said, there's a frum couple that has a small business. But in this business, they're not paying sales taxes. They're not collecting sales taxes and paying to the state what they're supposed to pay. So they wanted me to ask you whether you thought that was okay. From a halachic point of view, is that okay? Rav Schwab turned to the man and said, what do you mean frum? He says, they're not frum. You can't be having a dishonest business and call yourself frum. Doesn't make any sense. It's an oxymoron. And I think that's precisely the point that Isaiah is making here. You can't rob and steal and ignore the plight of the widow and the orphan and then go and look to make sure that there's a hechsher on every bag of potato chips that you eat. That's what Isaiah is saying God doesn't want. He didn't reject the idea of ritual. He's not saying that Judaism shouldn't have, that we shouldn't observe rituals in Judaism. He's saying don't observe rituals and then go and lie and cheat and conduct a dishonest business. And I think that is the point that Isaiah is making, and one that, of course, is always good to bear in mind, that we need to pursue both the ethics and the morality, and to be concerned with the plight of those in need at the same time that we're concerned about issues of observance. Good Shabbos.